Welcome back, everybody. Today we're diving into something uh, a little provocative, maybe.
A little bit scandalous, even.
Oh, yeah, Emmanuelle.
You guys sent in a ton of stuff for this one. Articles, excerpts about the films, the star, the whole cultural phenomenon surrounding it.
Yeah, it's crazy how much there is, right? I
Yeah.
mean, we're talking the original book from like 59, then the first film blew up in 74.
And it keeps going. Like there's a reboot plan for 2024, so clearly this thing has legs.
It really does.
Oh.
Okay, so 6 original films, then those made-for-TV movies in the 90s.
Emmanuelle in space, even.
Don't forget that one. They slapped her name on everything.
It's wild. But it speaks to that lasting fascination, doesn't it? So if you're listening along, picture this. 1974, the very first Emmanuelle film hits theaters. It's the story of a diplomat's wife in Bangkok.
Right, and her journey of, shall we say, sexual awakening.
Exactly. Now, we've got to remember, this wasn't just some low-budget quickie. The director, just checking, had a background in photography, so...
The visuals were stunning, right? I read about that.
They were lush, almost romantic.
Yeah.
You know, and even though the story was explicit, it wasn't just about that. There was this thread of Emmanuelle's self-discovery, her agency. It was different, and it made a huge impact.
Especially in Europe, right?
Big time. It was a box office smash. So we have this artistry mixed with the eroticism, and that's what set Emmanuelle apart.
Then Emmanuelle 2 comes along, and things get...
Well, a little more complicated.
More complicated is a good way to put it. Now we're in Hong Kong, the visuals are even more vibrant, but the story takes some turns.
Emmanuelle's mentoring this younger woman.
Exactly, and there's a lot more explicit content. Some people argue it lost that depth from the first film.
That it became more exploitative, almost.
That's a common criticism. And it's worth considering, right? Did the sequel, while visually impressive, maybe lose some of the soul that made the original so impactful?
Which brings us to Sylvia Christel, the woman who became Emmanuelle for so many people.
And this is where things get kind of crazy, because despite the film's massive success, get ready for one of those shocking facts we all love. Christel was only paid the equivalent of about $6,000 today for that role.
It's wild, isn't it? You'd think with all the money that film made.
But that's Hollywood, right? Especially back then.
It was a different time, and actresses, especially in films with explicit content, were often exploited, their contributions minimized. It makes you wonder, though, how much has really changed.
That's a good point. And it kind of sets the stage for the struggles Christel faced later on, doesn't it?
Absolutely. She felt trapped by the role. The media hounded her. Rumors were flying around.
It's kind of a tragic story when you think about it.
It is. It shows the complexities of fame, especially for women in that era. They could be celebrated and exploited at the same time.
Now, both of these films came out right in the middle of the sexual revolution, right? This huge period of social change. But even then, the way consent was portrayed in Emmanuelle was...
blurry, to say the least.
Yeah, blurry is one word for it. There's a lot of implied consent situations that would probably raise some eyebrows today.
Absolutely. And that's important for you listening because it reflects how much our understanding of consent has evolved. What might have been acceptable back then is definitely not okay now.
And Christel's own views on the films, they changed over time too, didn't they?
They did. At first, she kind of embraced the role, saw it as empowering. But later on...
she acknowledged the objectification.
yeah, she started to talk about feeling used, reduced to a sex symbol. It's a reminder that even within something like feminism, there are a ton of different perspectives.
No easy answers, right?
Not at all.
Yeah.
What one person might see as liberating, another might find deeply problematic.
Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into those differences between the first two films. Because one thing that struck me was how Emmanuelle herself changes. You know, in the first one, she's more reserved, like she's being led by her husband, Jean.
You're right. It's a journey of awakening for her. And Jean's almost like a mentor, encouraging her exploration.
There's a lot of focus on her emotional responses, too. And there are even some philosophical bits about love and sexuality woven in.
It's surprisingly thoughtful at times.
But then in Emmanuelle 2, she's almost like a different person.
Yeah.
Much more assertive.
Seeking out encounters.
With both men and women.
She takes control. Embraces her desires openly.
And it's not just Emmanuelle's behavior that changes, right? The whole story shifts to reflect this different take on female sexuality.
Yeah.
It's like the filmmakers were trying to keep up with the changing culture.
But maybe not in the most nuanced way.
Right. It's like they cranked up the volume on everything.
The visuals, the explicitness, that sense of adventure. And of course, they had a bigger budget for the second one, so...
the production quality is definitely a step up.
Oh, yeah. Brighter colors, more dynamic shots of Hong Kong. It's a much slicker film.
The original had this darker, almost voyeuristic feel to it.
It did. So yeah, two films, both about sexual liberation, but they go about it in very different ways.
And even the portrayal of sexuality itself changes quite a bit.
It does. In the original, it was more about Emmanuelle's personal journey, her emotional responses to her experiences. There were even those philosophical bits about love and sexuality, remember?
Right, gave it this more introspective tone.
Exactly.
But Emmanuelle, too, went in a different direction.
It really did. The sequel leaned way more into the explicit sexual encounters, often prioritizing the eroticism over the story itself. There's this series of increasingly graphic scenes that at times overshadow any character development or emotional depth.
So it becomes more about spectacle than substance.
Some would say so, and that's a valid critique, right? It raises questions about what the filmmakers were trying to achieve.
Okay, so we've got these two films, both exploring sexuality, but with very distinct approaches. One more personal, one more...
Performative.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. And then there's that whole question of consent that we touched on earlier.
Right. And this is where things get really tricky, because these films are products of their time. You know, in the first film, consent is often implied rather than explicitly stated.
Like it's just assumed because of the context?
Exactly. Emmanuelle's journey starts with her husband encouraging her to explore her sexuality, but a lot of the interactions don't show clear verbal consent. The way it's framed within this romantic context, it can make it seem like her willingness is a given rather than something that's negotiated.
And this ties into the whole sexual liberation movement of the 1970s, right?
Absolutely. The film reflects that spirit of exploration, challenging traditional norms around sexuality. But it also highlights how the complexities of consent were often overlooked. The narrative kind of romanticizes situations that today we'd view as problematic.
Because they don't show clear agreement in sexual encounters.
Exactly. And what about Emmanuelle 2? How does it handle consent?
I feel like it gets even more ambiguous in the sequel.
You're right. It does. We see the series of sexual encounters that are much more graphic and less emotionally connected than in the original. While Emmanuelle seems to have more sexual agency, a lot of the scenes lack clear communication about consent. The film presents this more hedonistic approach to sexuality, where encounters are spontaneous, driven by desire, without explicit negotiation or acknowledgement of boundaries.
So basically, both films present this romanticized view of sexual encounters that doesn't really address the importance of clear consent.
That's right. And that can be concerning because it contributes to societal attitudes towards sex and relationships. By not depicting clear and affirmative consent, these films might actually reinforce problematic narratives that blur the lines between consensual and non-consensual encounters. This reflects a broader trend in cinema during that period where coercive behaviors were often overlooked or normalized under the guise of romance.
And that lack of clear consent becomes even more troubling when you consider the power dynamics at play, especially in Emmanuelle 2.
Yes. You're hitting on a really crucial point. The sequel often depicts relationships in a way that leans towards objectification, where female characters are presented as vehicles for male pleasure rather than active participants with their own desires and boundaries. This portrayal can reinforce harmful stereotypes about women's roles in sexual relationships, suggesting that women should be available for male gratification without necessarily emphasizing their autonomy or need for consent.
Which is a pretty stark contrast to that message of female empowerment that some people might take away from the films.
It is, and it highlights those complexities and contradictions that are baked into these narratives.
Okay, so we've talked about the films themselves.
Yep.
But now let's shift focus to Sylvia Kristel, the actress who brought Emmanuelle to life. Her life beyond Emmanuelle was pretty fascinating, wasn't it?
It was. She was in over 50 films.
But Emmanuelle is the one everyone remembers.
And that's part of the tragedy, isn't it? She tried to branch out, but that typecasting followed her everywhere. She even said once, "I stirred men's dreams. I'm tired of being portrayed as a liberated woman."
It's like she was both celebrated and imprisoned by that image.
Exactly. And then there's the financial side of things. We talked about the low pay for the first film.
But it's even worse than that, right?
It is. No bonuses, no share of the profits. She was basically cheated out of millions.
Which, again, makes you think about how Hollywood treated and maybe still treats certain actors, especially women.
It's a conversation worth having, for sure. And it might be interesting for you listening to compare Kristel's situation to modern actresses who take on roles with explicit content.
Right. Are things really that different today?
It's something to think about. So we have this backdrop of exploitation, both on screen and off.
But Kristel also had personal struggles too, didn't she?
She did. Addiction issues, tumultuous relationships. It's all laid bare in her autobiography, and it's hard to separate those struggles from the pressures of fame from the scrutiny she faced because of
Yeah,
Emmanuelle.
the rumors were relentless. I read
Yeah.
about that supposed affair with the French president.
Right. Completely unfounded.
But it just shows how her personal life became this public spectacle.
It's a reminder that fame has a price. And for Christelle, it seems like that price was her privacy and to some extent her agency.
Okay, so we've got this complex picture emerging. The films, the changing social norms, Sylvie Christel's own evolving views. And a big part of all of this is the feminist lens, right?
It is. It's interesting to see how even within the feminist movement, there were all these different reactions to Emmanuelle. It reminds us that feminism isn't a monolith. It's constantly evolving and wrestling with complex questions.
Like, how do we balance sexual liberation with concerns about objectification?
Exactly. Those are the kinds of debates that Emmanuelle sparked, and we're still grappling with them today.
We are. And Christelle herself was right in the middle of it all.
Mm.
Initially, she embraced the feminist label, saw the film as empowering. But then, as time went on, her perspective shifted.
She started speaking out about the objectification the way the film had typecast her. It's a reminder that personal experiences can really shape how we understand these complex issues.
And her collaborations with other women in the film industry probably influenced those evolving views as well, right?
Absolutely. Throughout her career, she worked with several influential women, including feminist filmmaker Noutchka van Brockel. These collaborations exposed her to different perspectives on feminism and artistic expression.
It's interesting to consider how those collaborations might have shaped her understanding of women's roles in cinema, especially during the time when the industry was so heavily dominated by men.
You're right. Those experiences likely gave her valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities that women faced in a male-dominated field. And in her later years, Christelle continued to reflect on her legacy and the implications of her early work.
She became more aware of the emotional toll of being idolized for her beauty and the unrealistic expectations that came with it.
Exactly. She recognized that the beautiful pay more dearly than others, suggesting an awareness of how societal standards of beauty can be exploitative and damaging.
It's a really poignant observation that speaks to the pressures and complexities of being a woman in the public eye.
It is, and her candid discussions about her personal struggles with addiction further illustrate her complex relationship with fame, beauty, and the expectations placed upon women in the entertainment industry. Overall, Sylvia Christel's views on feminism evolved from an initial embrace of the movement's ideals tied to sexual liberation to a more nuanced understanding shaped by her personal experiences, societal pressures, and professional collaborations.
Her journey highlights the ever-evolving nature of feminist thought and the importance of individual experiences in shaping our understanding of complex social issues.
It's a reminder that feminism is not a one-size-fits-all ideology, but rather a dynamic and evolving movement with a wide range of perspectives and interpretations.
Now, we've talked about the films, Christel's experience, the feminist angle, but there's another layer here that I find really fascinating. The controversies that surrounded her personal life after Emmanuelle came out. It's like the film bled into reality in a way.
It did, didn't it? It speaks to how powerful these films were, how they captured people's imaginations.
One of the biggest rumors was about her supposed affair with the French president at the time.
Totally unfounded, as far as we know.
But it just shows how her life became this tabloid fodder.
People couldn't separate the actress from the role. And even though she denied it over and over, the rumors persisted.
And it wasn't just the president, was it?
No, not at all. Her relationships with older men, especially Hugo Claus and Ian McShane, were constantly being scrutinized.
It's like her personal choices were somehow up for public debate.
Which is never fair, is it?
No, not at all. And then, of course, there were her struggles with addiction, which sadly became very public.
Cocaine, alcohol, it was all over the news.
And that's the dark side of fame, right?
It is that loss of privacy, the way your personal struggles become this spectacle for public consumption.
It makes you wonder how much that contributed to her later difficulties.
It's impossible to say for sure, but it certainly didn't help. The constant scrutiny, the pressure to live up to this image, it takes a toll.
So we have this woman, Sylvia Christel, who became an icon, a symbol of sexual liberation for some.
But also a cautionary tale about the dangers of fame and exploitation.
It's a complex legacy, to say the least. And it makes you think about how we treat celebrities, how we consume their stories.
And the responsibility we have as viewers to be more discerning, more empathetic.
Absolutely. And it all ties back to these films, these Emmanuelle films, which, for better or worse, spark this cultural conversation that's still going on today.
They were a product of their time, a reflection of changing social norms, But they also help to shape those norms, to push boundaries, to spark debates.
And that's what makes them so fascinating to revisit, isn't it? They're not just erotic films. They're a window into a particular moment in history, a moment of liberation, confusion, and ultimately a lot of unanswered questions.
And for you listening, it's an invitation to consider how far we've come since then, how our views on sexuality, consent, and female agency have evolved, and how much further we still have to go.
Wow, it's like we've only just scratched the surface and we've already gone through so much.
That's the thing with something like Emmanuelle, it really ripples outward. So think about this, listeners. These films weren't just big in France, they were huge globally. Why do you think that is?
Well, it was perfect timing, right? The whole sexual revolution was happening. People were questioning traditional morality.
Right. And Emmanuelle, it offered this glamorous take on sexual exploration.
Yeah.
It really tapped into that energy. Now, we've talked about the problems, the consent issues, all of that.
But at the time, a lot of people saw these films as liberating.
They did. Here you have this woman who seems to be totally in control of her desires. And that was pretty radical back in the early 70s.
It challenged the status quo, for sure.
Big time. It might seem tame by today's standards, but back then, showing that kind of female sexuality on screen was a huge deal. It sparked debates, it pushed boundaries.
It got people talking, which
Right,
is often the first step towards change.
You got it. And it wasn't just about societal change. Emmanuelle had a real impact on the film industry itself. It proved that there was a market for this kind of erotic cinema.
Something more artful than just straight-up pornography.
Exactly. It wasn't just about shocking people. It was about creating a mood, an atmosphere.
And appealing to a wider audience, right?
Yeah.
Women included.
You got it. This wasn't just for the behind-the-counter at the video store crowd anymore.
Exactly. Emmanuelle helped to make erotic cinema a legitimate genre. It opened up space for different kinds of stories about sexuality to be told on screen.
And that influence is still felt today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We see more films, more TV shows that deal with adult themes in a more honest and complex way.
And Emmanuelle, for all its flaws, was a part of making that
It
happen.
was a pioneer, in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this cultural impact, this film industry influence,
Yeah.
but we can't forget the historical context.
Oh, for sure. The world was a very different place back then.
I mean, the sexual revolution was in full swing,
Huh.
but there was also a lot of pushback. More conservative voices saying, whoa, things are changing too fast.
It was this clash of liberation and resistance, and Emmanuelle landed right in the middle of it all.
Some saw it as a symbol of freedom, female empowerment. Others thought it was immoral, exploitative.
It's pretty wild, right? The same film could spark such totally opposite reactions.
And those debates are still going on today, aren't they? We're still trying to figure out what the sexual revolution really meant for women, for society as a whole.
Yeah, it's a conversation that's still unfolding. And Emmanuelle, whether you like it or not, is this fascinating time capsule from that era.
It's a reminder that history isn't always neat and tidy.
Definitely not. It's messy, it's full of contradictions, and art often reflects that.
Speaking of messy, I think we need to talk about consent.
Yeah.
We touched on it earlier, but it's such a huge part of the conversation around these films.
It really is. And for everyone listening, it's important to remember that back then, open discussions about consent, the kind we have now, they weren't really happening.
Right, it was a different time. And the films reflect that.
They do. There's a lot of implied consent situations that would be totally unacceptable today.
But we can't judge them solely by today's standards, can we?
We can't. They were made in a different time, with different social norms. But that doesn't mean we can't analyze them.
Right. We can use them as a starting point to see how far we've come in understanding consent.
Exactly. It's an opportunity to reflect on how much has changed and how much work we still have to do.
Because even though times have changed, the need for healthy relationships, for clear communication, that hasn't gone away.
You got it. It's as important as ever. Okay, so consent is one big issue.
But there are other things about these films that might make a modern viewer uncomfortable, right?
Absolutely. The way women are portrayed, the power dynamics between men and women. Some scenes can be pretty jarring when you watch them through today's lens.
You get that sense of the male gaze, that tendency to objectify women.
It's definitely there. And again, it's a product of the time. Women were often shown as complex individuals with their own desires, their own agency.
It was more about being an object of desire, fulfilling the male fantasy.
Exactly. And that's something we need to keep in mind when we watch these films today. It's not about saying those portrayals are okay. It's about understanding them in their historical context
In recognizing how far we've come in challenging those harmful stereotypes.
and pushing for better representations of women on screen.
Right, representations that are more nuanced, more respectful.
For sure. And it might be interesting for you listening to think about how those portrayals have changed over time. What films or shows have you seen that do a good job of representing women's desires, their complexities?
That's a great question. It helps you appreciate the progress that's been made and also see where we still need to improve. Okay, so we've talked about the controversial stuff.
But let's not forget about the cinematic side of things. Emmanuelle might be scandalous, but these films also have their own unique aesthetic, their own style.
I've always loved the cinematography, especially in the later films when they had bigger budgets.
Oh, they're beautifully shot, those exotic locations, the way they capture the sensuality of the environments.
And the music. Don't forget the music.
Oh, the music is so important. It adds so much to the mood, that atmosphere of romance and intrigue.
It really does. And the acting, while it's not always Oscar-worthy, there are moments of real chemistry between the actors.
There are.
Especially in the first one, I think Sylvia Christel brings this real charm, this innocence to the role. It makes Emmanuelle more relatable, even if her lifestyle is totally out there.
It's a tricky balance, and she nails it. So I think it's fair to say that these films, while problematic in a lot of ways, also have artistic merit.
They're not just trying to be exploitative. They're well made. They tell a story. They create a feeling.
And that's part of why they're so compelling, why they've lasted all these years. They capture a specific moment in time, a cultural shift, and they do it in a way that's both beautiful and unsettling.
And that's what we love about these deep dives, isn't it? We get to unpack these complex pieces of culture, see how they reflect the past and how they continue to shape us today.
We really do. We've gone from the films themselves to the life of the star, the societal changes, all the controversies. But there's one more piece I think is super important for everyone listening. Power dynamics.
We talked about Christel's low pay, but it's bigger than that, isn't it? It's about the way Hollywood often exploits certain actors, especially women.
It is. And it's not just a thing of the past. We see it happening today, too, just in different ways.
Like the pay gap between male and female actors.
Exactly. Or the types of roles women are offered, the stories that get told.
It's a systemic issue. And it's on us as viewers to be aware of it, to challenge it, to support the films and filmmakers who are doing things differently.
I completely agree. Our choices matter. Who we watch, who we celebrate, who we give our money to. It all sends a message.
So for you listening, think about this. What films have you seen that challenge those power dynamics, that show women as complex, fully realized characters?
Films that give them agency, that tell their stories with respect.
Those are the films we should be seeking out, the ones we should be supporting. Because they're not just entertaining, they're helping to create a better world.
And that's what art can do, right? Reflect the world we live in, but also imagine something better.
It's amazing, isn't it? We've covered so much ground with Emmanuelle, but I still feel like we've only scratched the surface.
I know what you mean. There's always more to uncover, more to think about.
Definitely. You know, as we've been talking about the films and their impact, something's been on my mind. How do you think the portrayal of female pleasure in cinema has evolved since Emmanuelle?
That's a really interesting question. Those films were considered groundbreaking at the time, but looking back now,
By today's standards, they feel a bit different.
they do, don't they? Even with the artistry, Emmanuelle's pleasure was often shown through the male gaze. It was part of her liberation, sure, but it makes you wonder, on whose terms was that liberation really happening?
Right. It feels more like a performance sometimes, rather than a genuine exploration of her own desires.
Exactly. And that's where I think the biggest shift has happened. These days, there's so much more focus on representing female pleasure in different ways. Stories that are created by women for women.
Can you give some examples?
Absolutely. Take someone like Erica Lust, for example. She's a filmmaker known for her feminist approach to erotic cinema. Her films put female perspectives front and center, exploring desire, intimacy, and pleasure in a way that feels authentic and empowering.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it's not just happening in independent film then?
No way. Mainstream media is catching up too. Think about a show like Sex Education. It's not just about the act itself. It's about the emotions, the relationships, all the complexities of communication.
It's refreshing, isn't it? It feels like we're finally moving away from that one-dimensional, often male-defined idea of what female pleasure is supposed to look like.
Totally. And a lot of that is thanks to more female directors, writers, and actors having a voice. They're bringing their own experiences and perspectives to these stories, which is so important.
It really is. I wonder, though, how much has technology played a role in all of this? The way we consume media has completely changed since the Emmanuelle era.
Ooh, good point. Streaming platforms have been a game changer. They've given independent filmmakers, those with diverse voices and perspectives, a much bigger platform to reach audiences.
And then there's the internet itself. It's opened up so many spaces for open conversations about sexuality. We're challenging taboos, building communities, sharing experiences. It's a whole new landscape.
It is. And for everyone listening, this could be a great starting point for your own exploration. What are you watching, reading, experiencing that reflects this evolution? Has it changed how you think about sexuality or pleasure?
That's what I love about these deep dives. They're just the beginning of your own journey of discovery.
They're about sparking curiosity, challenging assumptions, and reminding us that these conversations are always evolving.
And the legacy of Emmanuelle, as complicated as it is part of that bigger picture. It reminds us of how far we've come and how much further we still have to go.
That's a great way to put it. We've explored the films, the star, the controversies, the cultural impact. But ultimately, it's up to each of us to keep exploring these themes, to keep asking questions, to keep the conversation going.
Because understanding is a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And as we've seen with Emmanuel, that journey can be fascinating, challenging, and ultimately incredibly rewarding.
So keep thinking critically, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep talking about these things.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.